Cool.
All right.
Should we go?
Cool. Good.
Okay, I can do the honors. I think we have a bunch of people all together. Cool. Okay, we're live. Hello, everyone. I am Marta, and I'm going to be the session chair for today's seminar, which is co-organized with Franz, Chris, Shagan, and Carl. You can wave at the camera. So the general format of this type of seminars is that we aim at having 50 minutes of talk and about 10 minutes of questions. However, I've also been asked by Jakob that he wants to have this as a very interactive session. So if you have any questions, any clarification, whatever, just pop it on the side in the chat, and he should be able to see it. And if he doesn't, then I'll point it out to him. So that should all work fine, hopefully. The slides will be put on our website, as well as in the description of the YouTube stream once we're done. As you know, this is being streamed to YouTube at the same time as being in this Meet call, and it will eventually also be on YouTube for you to watch. And then finally, one last thing of housekeeping, please make sure you're all muted. We're actually going to watch out for anyone who's not, but just in case, so we can actually hear the speaker, make sure that you're muted. So with that out of the way, let me introduce today's speaker, Jakob Foerster. Jakob is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto and the Vector Institute, but he's also currently working at FAIR in California. Before all of this, he did his PhD at Oxford doing multi-agent RL. I personally met him during his internship at DeepMind. This was way in 2017. And he's also interned at OpenAI as well as Google Brain. Finally, I don't know if any of you know, but there is this NeurOps workshop called Emergent Communications that was started in 2017, and he's been involved in organizing it since, and it's been going strong. And related to maybe that topic of communication, I guess, today he's going to be giving a talk that I'm very excited about on learning to communicate, cooperate, and coordinate. And with that, take it away, Jakob.
Wonderful. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Marta. Thank you all for being here. So I believe, and I've believed for a long time, that whenever we think about machine learning, we have to think about multi-agent learning. And that's because our machine learning systems are deployed in the real world, and this real world contains other users. Those other users might be, those other agents might be the human users, but there might also be other learning systems in the same environment. For example, if you Google, there might be another recommender systems or another search engine out in the world. And those real other agents have points of views, they have beliefs, and they have learning dynamics. And if we don't account for those factors, then unintended side consequences can happen, and we fail to reach good policies. So let's think a little bit about what these multi-agent problems are. The first one is very obvious. You have a swarm of drones in the sky, and all these drones can observe some patch of land below them. They have local observations, but they have to coordinate as one group in order to rescue this poor victim that was stranded in the desert. However, there are also some multi-agent learning problems in disguise. So people working on GANs know that they are generators and discriminators. That means there are two different agents optimizing different losses. And when we have settings like this, we have to think about how those losses interact and how the optimization interacts. Another great multi-agent problem is traffic. In this example here, we have a number of different agents pursuing different intentions. And furthermore, all agents need to actively try and encourage others to cooperate to maintain the smooth flow of traffic, which seems to have failed in the example I'm showing on this slide. A multi-agent problem that will play a big part in my presentation is human-AI coordination, where we have a robot that's trying to help a human, and that's obviously a setting where two agents are interacting in a fully cooperative context. Now, you might think that we have sort of solved multi-agent learning because in the last decade or so, we've seen a lot of progress in AI beating humans at many, many games. It doesn't matter whether you think about chess, about Go, about Dota or poker. In all of these settings, the best AI systems now beat the very best human players. But there's something that all of these games have in common. They're two-player zero-sum. And that means in these settings, the only goal is to beat the other party. And that begs the question, as AI scientists, is it really our goal to humiliate an ever greater number of humans by beating them at something that they have practiced their entire lives? And I'd like to argue, no, this cannot be our goal. Instead, we have to build AI systems that can cooperate with humans, help them, support them, work in teams, and learn reliably in a multi-agent world of conflicting interests and maintain cooperation. And as it turns out, the skills required for the right-hand side are very different from those required for beating a human at your favorite game, at your favorite competitive game. And in particular, for the right-hand side, we require things like communication, cooperation, maintaining cooperation, and coordination. And those three C's have been at the very core of my research agenda ever since the beginning of my PhD. To make progress on this agenda, I'll be using the framework of the Markov decision process, or MDP for short, and reinforcement learning. In reinforcement learning, we have an environment shown on the right-hand side, and we have an agent shown on the left-hand side. The agent obtains observations, it's early in the morning, and rewards R from the environment and takes action U. Upon receiving the action, environment transitions to a new state S prime that's sampled from a conditional distribution conditioned on the Markov state S and the previous action U taken by the agent. The goal of this agent is to interact with this environment over and over again to learn an optimal policy, a policy that maximizes the total expected return per episode, which is nothing but the discounted sum of rewards, where each reward at time step t is discounted by a factor gamma to the t. What's crucial here is the state is updating, but the environment is typically static. That means the transition dynamics and so on don't change while the agent is interacting with this environment. We'll also be using deep reinforcement learning, where we have a deep neural network that maps from observations of the agent to distributions over actions or expected values for the agent. And those neural networks are parameterized by weights theta indicated here. Clearly, having one agent isn't quite enough if we're interested in multi-agent problems. So instead, we'll have the red, the blue, and the green agent, and they all get their own observations O and take their own actions U and get their own rewards R in general. What makes this complicated is that in general, the future development of the system doesn't just depend on the actions of one of the agents, but depends on the joint action of all of the agents in the environment. And we look at the consequence of that in a variety of settings now. The first aspect I will focus on is cooperation. And what I mean by that is, how can agents entice other agents to maintain cooperation or cooperate with them in settings of conflicting interest? Clearly, if the entire world was consisting of a single brand of self-driving cars on the roads, there would never be a conflict of interest. But we all know this is not the case. Instead, we have diverse points of views, interests, and dynamics on the road from different drivers. The stereotypical problem for studying conflicting interest is the prisoner's dilemma. In the prisoner's dilemma, in case you haven't seen it, I'll give a quick review. Two people got caught robbing a bank, and they're being interrogated independently by the police. They can either remain silent, which means they cooperate with each other, or they can defect against the other party. If both sides cooperate, everyone spends the least amount of total years in prison, which is 1 year per person. However, there's an incentive for each of the people to defect against the other party to get out of prison earlier. In the single shot dilemma, there's nothing you can do if you're an intelligent strategic agent. You have to defect against the other party. However, the game we're looking at is iterated. And that means that they go and get robbed or get caught by the police every single day and have a chance to defect or cooperate every day. What this means is that now each agent can actually entice the other agent to cooperate with them by rewarding cooperation and punishing defection. Let's look at what happens if we apply the most popular multi-agent learning method in this setting, and that's called independent or naive learning. In the naive learning, each agent simply pretends that other agents are part of the environment as shown here. So from the red agent perspective, there's only an environment, there are no other agents. Those have been wrapped into this environment. Crucially though, because other agents are learning, this environment now is non-stationary. And it's not non-stationary like the weather, which changes independently of my actions, where I can simply respond to it at every given day. Instead, it's non-stationary in a way that it changes corresponding and responding to the previous actions because other agents are learning based on the interaction with me. However, naive learning completely ignores this. Every agent simply models other agents as being static or disappearing. And as a consequence, perhaps unsurprisingly, if you run naive learning in the iterated prisoner's dilemma, where we know that good outcomes are possible, these agents will simply learn to defect. And defection here is the worst case outcome in aggregate, where all agents spend 2 years in prison. You can think of this as the catastrophic failure case of cars crashing into each other on the road, rather than managing to maintain cooperation. We addressed this issue in our paper called Learning with Opponent Learning Awareness, or LOLA for short, in which each agent models other agents in the environment as naive learners that optimize their own objective. And as a consequence, The Lola agent now directly models the impact of their actions on the learning dynamics of other agents in the same environment. It turns out that making that simple change to the algorithm going from naive learning to Lola learning has drastic consequences on the outcome of learning in settings of conflicting interest. In particular, in the iterative prisoner's dilemma, the Lola agents actually learn to punish and reward other agents, enticing them to cooperate with them in the iterated game. And you can think of this as being the successful outcome of maintaining smooth traffic flow by cooperating with others. I also showed the example of GANs on my very first slide. And indeed, Lola has been extended by a master student I work with to stable opponent shaping in general sum games, and this method, SOS, actually has been successfully applied to GANs, as you can see on the bottom, where you can successfully fit a mixture of Gaussians. The next C I will focus on is communication. And that's because communication is one of the most important things that humans do day to day. We spend between 50 and 80% of their workday communicating, and clearly our AI systems of the future will also have to be able to communicate with human users and with other AI agents. And in fact, I'm trying to communicate with everyone right now, and clearly this is not always an easy task if you're trying to make sense of what I'm saying at the moment. One thing that's required for communication amongst humans is called theory of mind. So imagine you're cycling down the road in London and you see a person next to a bus stop raise their hand. Well, immediately you know that there must be a bus behind you, because otherwise the person by the bus stop wouldn't be signaling for this bus that is behind you to stop. And this ability of humans to interpret the actions of others when observing them and to take actions that are informative when being observed by others is commonly summarized as theory of mind. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, you don't need to communicate with users, with others if you're trying to beat them at poker or at another zero-sum game. But it turns out there is a fully cooperative setting that lets us test those ideas in a highly complex, large dimensional game. And that's called Hanabi. The goal of Hanabi is to build stacks of cards, starting with the 1 and ending with the 5, 1 for each color. We get 1 point per card, so we get 25 points in total for 5 colors. And you can think of it as a type of fully cooperative poker, where with partial observability or collective card counting, as Mike Boning likes to call it. The twist in Hanabi is that while we're all working as one team, I can actually not see my own cards. So I'm holding my cards away from myself, so you can see my cards, I cannot see them. And we have to infer the intent of others to make sense of what we might be holding to figure out what we need to play next. So this is a DECBOM-DP, a decentralized partially observable Markov decision process, which means it's fully cooperative, partially observable, and therefore it's really focused on theory of mind. It's a really good testbed for self-play and also for human-AI coordination in DECBOM-DPs. So let me give you a brief rundown of the dynamics of Hanabi. So we're starting out the game. We have my partner's hand that I can observe. I can't see my own cards. And we have 8 hint tokens, which are the counting method for the hints we give, which are costly. And at this point, my partner tells me that I have 2 ones. At the beginning, because each stack starts with a 1, I can play each of these ones without knowing anything else about my partner, where this one came from. We pay 1 hint token, and we obtain a score for me playing this first card. At this point, my partner tells me that my first card is red. Now, this card being red doesn't tell me that this card is playable. This card could be a red 3 or red 4, red 5, or it could be the red 2. However, let's apply a theory of mind. My partner decided to tell me that this card is red. Therefore, that hint is probably useful. And therefore, I can probably play this card, because the aim of the game is to play cards. And indeed, it was the red 2, so while we've paid a hint token, we've now got another point. Remember, you can get 25 points in total. So let's think about this a little bit more in detail. What does it mean to interpret the actions of another agent? And that's nothing but Bayesian reasoning. So here we have Bob holding his cards as he should, away from himself. And Bob has some belief over his hand. This is the probability of his hand, given everything that has happened so far. And we have Alice. Alice looks at the hand of Bob and then decides to discard a 5th card. So what is it that Bob should learn about the world from Alice's action? This is nothing but the Bayesian posterior, where we have the probability of X given Y, the probability of the hand given the action. And we can just fill in all the numbers. And crucially, if we know the policy that Alice used to map from the hand of Bob to the action that she took, then Bob can replace the probability of the action given the hand by her policy. So this assumes that there's a means to evaluate this posterior and that Bob has access to this policy. But it also tells us something else about the learning in DECPOM-DPs. In an MDP, the new state S prime conditions simply on the previous state S and the action taken here. But in the DECPOM-DP, the belief over the state of the world conditions not just on the action taken, but also on the entire policy on what would have happened in different states of the world. And this is what makes learning in DECPOM-DPs so challenging. As an immediate consequence, we have to reason over not just what happened, the action, but also why it happened, which is the policy that produced the action at the given time step. So if we want to do sound learning in DECPOM-DPs, we have to first of all explore the policy at every time step, pi t, that map from private observations into actions. We have to have a means of generating those policies in a setting that is where the generation process is common knowledge to all agents in the environment, so that Bob can actually do the posterior inference. Bob has to be able to know what pi t is being explored. And we have to compute the correct belief for each of the given policies that is being explored at a time step. Those ideas have been explored before in small settings, and we found a means of scaling these ideas to very high dimensional settings like Hanabi in a paper called the Bayesian Action Decoder, where we used the public belief MDP. In this framing of the problem, the state of the system of our new MDP is a public belief over private features, B, and the current public features. We then produce a common knowledge policy that is sampled from a learned distribution over policies conditioned on the current public state. This is evaluated by the acting agent only for the current observation. The action is announced to the world and observed by everybody else. And we then calculate a Bayesian posterior, given that we know the action the policy that produced the action. This led to the first time state-of-the-art results in Hanabi from learning methods. So in Hanabi, as I said, you can get up to 25 points. In theory, though not all games are winnable under the rules. And we beat all existing hard-coded learning method and also our baselines at the time, obtaining 24.2 points. We were also lucky because while we didn't know about Fireflower at the time of writing the paper, we later found this bot that was really, really strong, a hand-coded bot plus search heuristics that gets around 52% win rate, and our method gets around 62% win rate in this setting. This bot obviously didn't know anything a priori about playing Hanabi or playing card games in general, but it learned these interesting conventions where it's signaling red or yellow to say I should play the newest card, and it's signaling white or blue in these runs to say I should discard the latest card. We asked the creator of this strongest bot that we had before, David Wu, about commentary. He looked at 300 games and sent us back a long analysis of the bot, and he said, this bot is very strong in the early game, and its convention set is far more efficient than natural human convention sets. It's really quite beautiful. So this is all very nice, and we've made more progress on Selfplay ever since. So we've simplified this method and approximated it in a paper called SAT, and then we've added search on top of it, and we've basically moved the state-of-the-art performance in Hanabi from 2 to 5 players, I think near human levels now in all settings. So this is the original BAT number now in different counting scheme. There's SAT. This is what you add. What happens if you add search on top of it? So very high numbers. But I think all of this is kind of missing the point, because while this is interesting technically, I don't think Hanabi is about arbitrary signaling and about how to figure out how we come up with the most cryptic protocol for playing the game. This has very little to do with how humans actually play the game and what the actual intent of the game was. And this can be addressed by thinking a bit more about coordination. So what actually is human AI coordination? Yes, it's a multi-agent problem. We have the human agent and the AI agent. It's also fully cooperative because the goal here is to help that human agent. And it's obviously partially observed because we don't know everything about the world. In particular, commonly the reward function exactly of the human is unknown. So it's a DECPOM-DP. That's great. But there's one more thing. It's certainly not a self-play setting because I can't pre-agree on actions in every possible state of the world. So this means we have to think about zero-shot coordination. Let me illustrate this a little bit more. What actually is self-play? Self-play is training a team of agents at training time that then is designed to do well in that exact same constellation at test time. And this is actually a really good idea in two-player zero-sum setting if you add, if you make sure that you converge to Nash equilibrium, because all the Nash equilibria in two-player zero-sum are interchangeable. And that means you don't care who you meet at test time. you can't do poorly at test time if you're playing in Nash equilibrium. The issue is that in fully cooperative settings, you can have perfect self-play policies that only work well within a specific team and do arbitrarily poorly when paired with other teams at test time. And this can be illustrated by looking at our, at the time, state-of-the-art self-play methods called SAT, where we train 12 independent runs of the same method, and we evaluate crossplay. So what you can see here is high points, around 24 something points on the diagonal, but if we make mixed teams of one run and another run, then we get very low performance. So even the same method trained on the same problem will produce extremely idiosyncratic and inconsistent policies. And that's because these agents use things like red and yellow to mean play the newest card, and white and blue to say discard the latest card. So these conventions are very, very efficient, but they're very different from human conventions. So this is great for the self-play setting if you only ever care about robots coordinating with the exact team they're trained in, but clearly can't work with humans or others. This is something we addressed in our paper called Other Play for Zero-Shot Coordination that was published at ICML in 2020. First of all, let's introduce zero-shot coordination. What is it? We still train a Brazilian team, but now we also train independently an Argentinian team. And the goal of this process is to train two teams independently such that they can be matched together at test time in crossplay, in a combined team of those two different nationalities. And the goal now is for the coach to agree on a training strategy before training even starts. So they can't communicate during training. Training has to be done completely independently, but they can pre-agree on a strategy before training starts. And the question is, what should be the strategy that the coaches use? We know it should not be self-play, because self-play does horribly when you do so in many settings. And the key idea for our method was to use symmetries and equivalences. So here we have a tree that has nodes and edges. And if you take a little permutation of red and yellow, you see that you still have the same tree. And that means that in this tree, we have three equivalence classes. Red and yellow are in one equivalence class. You can exchange those labels, and you still obtain the same tree. And purple and green are in another equivalence class. And clearly, DEC-POM-DPs are trees. You have nodes and edges and transitions between them. And therefore, we can apply that same reasoning to the entire DEC-POM-DP. So we can find mappings phi that, when applied to the DEC-POM-DP, leave the entire tree unchanged. And if there is such a mapping phi, that's a symmetry. And the set of all symmetries is capital phi. And because we can apply this mapping phi to the entire DEC-POM-DP, we can also apply to policies, because we can simply have a new policy that acts on the DEC-POM-DP after phi has acted upon it. Why is this useful? Because we can now go from self-play to our new algorithm, other play. So in self-play, we can maximize the joint objective under the joint policy pi, where we can exactly maximize pi 1 and pi 2 arbitrarily to obtain an optimal self-play score. In contrast, in other play, we have to be robust to my partner at test time choosing any of the equivalent policies. That means if I think during training that pi 2 is a great policy, phi of pi 2 has to be equally likely. And we simulate this by, during training, sampling all the different equivalences from the set of all possible equivalences and evaluating objective that now maximizes over equivalence classes. And that's shown here. So in our other play objective, because I'm sampling all the equivalent policies pi 2, I am now evaluating the expected score of the equivalence class pi of phi. And clearly, now I can no longer break symmetries arbitrarily, because I have to be robust to symmetries being broken inconsistently at test time. Because this is implemented as a type of asymmetric domain randomization, we can actually implement other play on top of any deep reinforcement learning algorithm, which is nice. So what are the consequences of this? Let's first look at this in a little bit as a picture. So what does this do? We're still training two independent teams, the Brazilian team and the Argentinian team. But now at every time step, we will permute one half of the team independently from the other side. So we apply these randomizations arbitrarily. So as a consequence, what happens is that in Hanabi, the crossplay score gets increased from 2.5 points for the self-play method by 13 points if we just add this other play idea. We can then increase the scores further if we add an auxiliary task. So here we get to about 22 points in crossplay. So if you now train 2 independent agents and evaluate them, they on average get around 22 points. So this tells you that you can actually have AI systems that are trained independently, but can coordinate at test time in this setting. But maybe what's more important is, or more exciting, this actually translated directly to better human AI coordination results in a zero-shot setting. So what's showing here is an evaluation where we evaluate humans with our other play bot and our self-play bot. Each of these blue little dots is one deck of Hanabi cards, because the deck changes the scores a lot. We now control for this by having each human play once with the other play bot, once with the self-play bot. We randomize the order to keep it consistent. And obviously different decks are played by different humans. And what you can see is that almost for all decks, the other play bot vastly outperforms the self-play bot. And in particular, the other play bot gets around 16 points when paired with a human in the very first game, while the self-play bot gets around 9 points. So other play learn more human compatible policies without requiring human data. And that's nice, because I think we've uncovered one of the first principles of coordination in complex settings, and that is, those shall not choose a policy from a set of equivalent but mutually incompatible joint policies. I think this is a great point in time to take some questions, because I've been going about 2x the speed of what is normally interpretable and understandable to the average human. I'm talking too much to bots.
We have a question actually from France already in the chat, so we can maybe start with that. And if anyone else has any questions, you can either put them also in the questions or literally just in that little chat bar on the side. Can you see the chat, or do you want me to read it out? Or maybe France?
I can post it, it's no problem.
Right.
Thanks, it's been really interesting so far, Jacob. I was wondering, so you were talking about essentially equivalence classes of policies.
Mm-hmm.
So in the good old MSDM community in the 2000s, 2010s, we were looking into this this concept of influence search. I'm not certain if you have ever looked at it, but it sounds quite similar to some extent.
That sounds interesting. Can you expand a little bit?
So there, the idea is that, so it goes back, I think the first paper that I know about this is the paper by Raven Becker, who had this transition independent deck MDPs. So the kind of like quick example is, imagine you have 2 robots, they go on a different side of somehow a crater. They don't affect each other, but you know, if they make a picture from the crater from both of their sides, then you may now be able to do, say, 3D reconstruction or so. So they don't affect each other, but there's some additive value if they both make the picture. So now from the perspective of one agent, even though now the problems are coupled, but there's only one thing that matters, namely, okay, what is the probability that the other agent makes the picture? And so that bundles together all these policies in equivalence classes. And you know, there were a couple of algorithms to try and exploit these kind of ideas.
Interesting. So here, just to be clear, this is not a weakly coupled. This is a full deck POMDP formalism. We're not looking at like a specific subset. I think here the goal is really to, how can I put this? The goal is to prevent arbitrary coordination, arbitrary symmetry breaking, right? That's what the goal here is in other play, right? So if we go back, I can go back to the.
Yeah, so I guess to some extent, I'm trying to understand what are the types of equivalence classes that you're capturing, right? Because
it's anything at this point that is a true symmetry of the environment. So, for example, if you're in a room and you have 2 axes, X and Y, and the room is symmetric and the goal is in the middle, then inverting the x-axis, inverting the y-axis, and also commuting the action space at the same time of the robot would be an equivalence, right? In Hanabi, so I made this presentation very fast because I don't get to the new things, but in Hanabi, the equivalences here are the colors. So equivalence is arbitrary, the colors are arbitrary labels. And if you change all the labels, the card game doesn't change, right? So if my red becomes your yellow, then the game is the same game, because, you know, you can go from like a yellow 4 to yellow 5 in the fireworks and all that, right? But the symmetry in Hanabi are the colors. And it's the self-play agents will actually break that symmetry because it's useful. Because if we can agree that like yellow arbitrarily means you should play your first card and red means you should play your third card, I can suddenly coordinate much better with you. But the problem is that that's arbitrary. So there's no way that if I have another agent I test them that's trained independently, you will have consistent symmetry breaking. Right? And then basically the other play objective simulates that process of test time being matched with someone else by shuffling all the symmetries around for one of the agents in the world. So it's an asymmetric type of domain randomization that we're running here in the objective, where basically at training time, every episode, your view of the world is a different color shuffling from mine.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds as if it is a different type of structure, but somehow it also sounds as if there could be a link, but we should probably take it offline. But
yeah, the closest I know of is work by Hazani et al. From like in-game theory that have looked at coordination settings, but it's in a different formalism. It's in I forget exactly what it was now, but I think it's like normal form games or standard form games, and it's the whole point here is that in the DECPOM you actually have repeated time steps. So agents can, to some way or another, they can adapt to each other, and they should adapt to each other because it's an extended game. Right? We have multiple time steps, but there are still policies that just will not work at test time. Right? And that's what our self-play policies learn. And I think actually, in most cases, when we're doing multi-agent learning in fully cooperative settings, we should think about zero-shot coordination. It's if you're not even consistent with yourself across different runs, you have a problem at test time because the world is not entirely under your control. In almost all settings, there will be other agents that are either partially or entirely independently trained and partially known. Right? And it's the idea of this framework is that they are really principled that we can algorithms that use the structure of the DECPOM to coordinate with others, rather than using focal points or shelling points where you condition on common access to labels. Right.
Yeah, well, very interesting. Happy to look into it.
Any more questions?
Yeah, there's a bunch. So maybe I'll go through them in order. Florian, do you guys want to just like dial in and ask them yourselves if you want? If Florian is there, otherwise we can read them out.
It's a very naive and practical question. Is how do you define your symmetry? In Hanabi, I can understand that you know the rules, so you can define them in advance. But are there any way to learn them? Or...
Good question. Can we learn the symmetries? So graph isomorphisms, I think, is a pretty hard problem. I will, at the very end, if I have time, and there's a follow-up paper we did called Rich Rider. It's a NURBS paper from last year. You can look at that. Basically, there are certain ways that we have explored now. We can use the landscape of optimization. So in other words, the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of the Hessian can tell you about symmetries in some problems. And that's because if you have equivalences in the parameter space, that leads to repeated eigenvalues. And you can use that structure to discover symmetries and then do other play-like algorithms without knowing the symmetries a priori. So good question. We have some answers, not all of them. But I also think symmetries are sometimes not the right answer, and I'll get to something even better in the next half of the talk. Well, I tell you why like other play is not enough. It's a bad idea and we should do something else instead in a lot of settings. But great question. Thank you.
Thanks. Now we have Donkey Kim. I think he also has a question. Do you want to dial in?
Yes. Hey, Jacob. So I think I was interested in applying this other play algorithm onto some asymmetric games, such as a kicker versus goalkeeping game, such as I wonder whether the theory of the symmetry that you explained today can be applied to asymmetric games, maybe, or it's...
So you can have player asymmetries. That's totally fine, as long as you have symmetries in the world. So for example, if you're playing Hanabi, I have 7 cards, you have 5 cards. We have player asymmetry, not a problem. We can still apply color shuffling, right? Now, there's one way to interpret your question, which is, what if you don't have symmetries? What if you have a world without true symmetries? You can change that tree I showed you and make it a little different, and then suddenly everything fails, right? And I'll address that in the next half. Good question. Thank you.
Cool. Anthony, do you want to speak up?
Sure. Jacob, my question is that what do you think are the main challenges to extending this same other play principle to games where they're not fully cooperative, mixed motive games? Or would you recommend just trying a different approach entirely?
I think it's so if they're not fully cooperative, but there's ways to cooperate, then I try and like think about this problem in two stages. First of all, can I establish cooperation in the game? And then once I've established cooperation, can I coordinate? Can I execute on the cooperation, right? And I think if you think of it in that way, then yeah, you want to apply other play at the point of time where you've managed to establish cooperation and trying to execute on your strategy. And then there might be, again, this robustness, we can't pre-agree exactly on everything in the world, so I shouldn't be very arbitrary. Otherwise, we'll fail to cooperate. We'll fail to coordinate as part, although we're trying to cooperate. If there is no, if it's two players or some, you don't need this. Just turn the crank. Two players or some, find your niche, you're done. Go home, be happy. Unless you want to be really greedy and like not just win every game, but also win it with a lot of points and like exploit weaknesses. I think in fully competitive, I wouldn't do something like this. Turn the crank. We kind of know what to do in two players or some. Yeah. Great question. Thank you. Anything else?
Well, yeah, we have one more question. You're getting a lot of questions. It's really good. So Ahmad, do you want to dial in yourself for a final question? I don't know if he's on the line. Otherwise, I can read it out.
Yeah, just thank you for your presentation. My question is, could you compare the computational complexity of self-play and other play?
Yes, great question. So what we found, in principle, it looks like other play should be more expensive because you're sampling random permutations. But in reality, what we found is that actually your network just ends up learning that invariance, equivariance, and therefore the computational complexity is not much higher than self-play, right? So, but you do have to know the symmetries. Great question again. So in the next, any more questions at this point?
There are no more in the chat. So maybe what we can do is we continue. And then if anyone keep asking those great questions, and then at the end, we'll do maybe another sweep over questions.
Awesome.
Good with you.
Cool. So this work was all like a little bit older. I've talked about it often, which is why I talk about it quickly because I'm bored with the work. I mean, you should be excited, but I'm bored. And also, there's a real question here, what happens if you don't have symmetries? Now I'll talk about Offbelieve Learning, which is brand new. So good news for you. It's really new and exciting. Bad news for you. This is one of the first times I've ever talked about it. So if the previous stuff was confusing, this is going to be really confusing. Okay, so get ready. Get all your questions ready. So what's the fundamental issue in the POMDPs? We can actually zoom in a little bit on why coordination is hard. And that is, even if there is a way of exchanging information in a grounded way, in Hanabi, you can tell me that this card is a 4, right? You can actually do that. You can pay a token and tell me this is a 4. RL agents don't really want to do that because it's costly. And instead, what they're going to do is they're going to learn some arbitrary encoding between actions and meaning. So if you can observe my actions and you and me are being trained in the same environment, RL agents will always want to break partial observability by learning really bizarre encodings of information. They learn these like voodoo codes. And that's a bit like a bee wiggle dance. But actually, bee wiggle dance is pretty well structured. So if you did self-play to learn a bee wiggle dance, it wouldn't look like this nice structured thing. It'd be this really bizarre like hash code that maps from observations to meanings. And even on the other play, there might still be many, many weird ways of encoding information that we didn't get rid of. So we got rid of the colorway. You can't tell me that red means something different from yellow because red and yellow are equivalent as per the other play objective. But let's look at another example where we have the fireworks here. And we have some sequence where the first agent discards the 4th card. It just so happened that the second agent plays the first card and the card is playable. Immediately, we have the sequence whereby the RL agent now is going to pick up on the fact that, playing the first card when the 4th card was this card that leads to a point. And you get the self-reinforcing convention here. And we've actually seen this. So agents, the weirdest agents I've seen in Hanabi self-play learn to signal discarding codes where if I discard my 4th card, you discard your first, you play your first card. If I discard my 2nd card, you do something else, right? Really bizarre codes, highly arbitrary. If you play with them, you have no idea what's going on. And that's obviously persistent, even if I get rid of symmetries, because the first, the fourth card and the third card are not symmetric under the deck POM-DP. They are distinct entities in the deck POM-DP, so I can't shuffle them at training time. So the question is, what do we do, right? And our answer is called Offbelieve Learning. So what is Offbelieve Learning? Offbelieve Learning takes the weirdness out of deck POM-DP learning because it fixes the meaning of every possible action. And that is done by starting the process with a fixed given policy pi0. And the only thing we agree on during training is that all past actions are interpreted as if they had been played by pi0. So we're assuming at every point in time t, when I'm doing inference over the world, what's the state of the world given my action observation history, I assume or pretend my partner played pi0. But it's common knowledge that pi1 will be played ever after in all future moves. And obviously pi1 in return is again going to assume that all my actions are coming from pi0. So what this corresponds to in Hanabi, and you can try this out if you have the game at home or want to play it online, it corresponds to saying that we sit down and we say, I'm going to play Hanabi optimally, and I'm going to assume that you're playing optimally, under caveat that in the simplest case, all my actions only mean what they mean. And that I will also interpret your actions as having no further meaning beyond the grounded information revealed by the environment. Okay, so if pi0 is random, obviously, then a random agent does not convey any counterfactual information about the world, right? So if a random agent decides to discard their fourth card randomly, then by definition, this tells you nothing about your hand, right? And if a random agent decides to tell you that this card is red, it can only mean this card is red. It cannot mean anything else about the world because there's no posterior information in it. And obviously, discarding a card means nothing. So that is the very crux of Offbelieve Learning. Let's introduce another concept here, and that is the grounded belief. So the grounded belief, if we do any inference on this pi0, right? So remember, we're going to interpret all past actions according as if pi0 had played them. So we have some probability distribution of P of tau given tau I. Tau I is my action observation history. Tau is the world state. This is, again, this posterior inference that I showed before. And here we're doing inference assuming that actions were taken by pi0. So it's the probability of the action being taken in a given world state, in a given action observation history for the other agent. But crucially, this depends on the policy, unless pi0 is a blind policy that doesn't actually look at the world. If pi0 doesn't look at the world, then it cancels at the top of the bottom, and we get this grounded belief, which is the probability of the state of the world given my action observation history, my view of the world, completely independent of the policy that generated it. Okay? And in Hanabi response, if this all sounds really weird to you, well, it's simply what are the card counts, what's the common knowledge, what's the public observation, what are the actual hints. Okay? And the optimal grounded policy is going to assume that everyone acts optimally on this grounded belief at every time step. And obviously, if I respond to a random policy, that's not an optimal grounded policy. I best respond to a random policy. And also, you might be tempted to say, well, now we have this grounded belief. I can just, parameterize it, feed it into a feed-forward neural network, and train a policy on top of it. No, you cannot. And if that's confusing, think of it like this. The grounded belief will carry things like this card is red, right? And then already you can learn the signaling because this card is red correlates because pi1 took that action with this card being playable, for example. So, any questions so far? Otherwise, I'll keep going and hopefully things will clear up a little bit as I reiterate the same idea 3 times in different ways. This is sort of you're now the guinea pig of me trying to figure out how to best explain off-belief learning. So let me keep going.
Quick question, actually. Maybe,
yeah.
Can you maybe give an insight into how this relates back to the theory of mind, which you were talking earlier, where you were putting a lot of emphasis into trying to understand what the other player is thinking, but now it feels like you're removing a lot of that by saying, look, guys, we're going to assume there is none of that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me explain this.
Perfect.
So, wonderful question, Marta.
Thank you.
So I used to think that the hard thing about multi-agent learning take-home piece was to find the most informative policies, the thing that conveys information most optimally. And this is still a hard problem if you want to do it optimally. However, what's even harder is to try and get agents, to get them to stop to do this at all, right? So what if I don't want them to come up with arbitrary means of conveying information? Imagine you want to train a multi-agent system and you do not want your agents at all to do really bizarre communication stuff between them, because you want them to work with a human at test time, because you want them to work with independently trained agent at test time that does not understand their weird little things they're doing to convey information. So how do you train a system that plays the game or like acts optimally in the world, but cannot break partial observability? Right? So we're exactly trying to completely get rid of the counterfactual reasoning.
Yeah. So maybe
it's about optimizing counterfactual reasoning. This is about the other end of the spectrum. How can we completely get rid of counterfactual reasoning?
Would it be fair to say that then this means that you kind of realize that step 0 is actually getting rid of it? It doesn't mean that you don't eventually also want them to do some theory of mind stuff, but first you want to be able to not do it, and then on top of that, eventually, hopefully be able to somehow.
Actually, in the next couple of slides, we'll get there. Absolutely.
Cool.
Wonderful. Great question. So let's actually define a few things. So we have this value function, which is pi 0 up to time step t, and then pi 1 ever after. And that's nothing but the expectation of the value of playing pi 1 in the state of the world tau. And then we're sampling from this distribution of what the probability of the state of the world would be had I reached tau 1, had I reached tau I when playing with pi 0. Remember, I'm actually playing with pi 1 at all time steps, but I'm always calculating the probability distribution over the world as if I got into this place tau I playing with pi 0. That's at the crux of off-belief learning. I'm always off-belief with respect to my actual partner. And then I can also define a Q function here, which is just the Q function, but again, evaluated under the expectation of tau, state of the world, drawn from a distribution as if I had reached tau I playing with pi 0. Okay? Let's go into a little experiment. Everyone looks really confused. So let's do a little thought experiment to maybe illustrate some of this. So you have Alice and Bob, because I like the two of them, and Alice can turn on the light bulb. Sorry, I've switched the labels here to make it, so this is supposed to be Alice and this is supposed to be Bob. So the left-hand side can turn on the light bulb up here, can bail out of the game to get $1, or pay $5 to remove this barrier. The right-hand side then needs to guess the pet. They get $10 if they get it correct. They pay $10 if they get it wrong. And they can also bail out of the game and receive 50 cents. So what's the optimal self-play policy here? Remember, if Bob turns on the light, the right-hand side can observe the light bulb. And if Bob removes the barrier, then Alice can see this, if it's a pet or a dog, right? So here you have a grounded communication channel, which costs you money to remove the barrier. Typically using grounded channels costs something. Or you can use a cheap talk channel, which is this light bulb up here, right? And if you think about this, let's look at self-play first. Imagine there's some initial policy that turns on light when there's a cut, right? We have a state of the world. Bob turns on the light. Alice observes light is on and there's a barrier. Alice's optimal action now is just to guess cut. And at this point, they get 10 points. And Bob learns to always turn on the light when there's a cut. And Bob learns to signal through cheap talk that there's a cut, I turn on the light, there's a dog, I turn off the light, right? Obviously, it could be vice versa. What happens in off-belief learning? In off-belief learning, the state is still a cut. Bob still decides to turn on the light. Alice still sees light bulb is on plus barriers there. But now in the off-belief learning state of the world, when we're doing Q learning for Bob, is going to be sampled as if Alice had reached this state playing with a fully random Bob. And that means there's no correlation between the light being on and there being a cut or a dog. It's 50-50. And that means that under off-belief learning, Alice's optimal action is actually 50-50. I don't care because I'm going to get 0 points anyway. And the reward for Alice is 0 in the off-belief learning transition that she learns from. And let's compare this to removing the barrier. In one scenario, Bob removes the barrier. Alice sees that, 5 points, whatever. 10 is better than 5, let's go for self-play, and let's go for cheap talk. In the off-belief learning setting, there's a cat. Bob removes the barrier. Alice sees light is off, but I can see the cat. The state of the cat doesn't care if a random agent moves the barrier. There's still a cat there. You can actually see the world. And therefore, in the off-belief learning transition, you still have the cat there. And then Alice learns to say, there's a cat, and gets 5 points. And that's the crux of off-belief learning. The crux is we wash out all the correlations induced by the gameplay of Pi1 for our learning agent. Okay? And what this means is self-play learns these cheap talk conventions, off-belief learning learns the optimal grounded policy. Now, there was a great question, which is what happens if you actually want to have a little bit of counterfactual reasoning? Not infinite loops, not sort of, at some point you discarded your 4th card and I played my 2nd card, and therefore I should do that ever after, and then use my 3rd discard to indicate that, today's the 21st of March. None of that, right? Some finite, well-controlled level of counterfactual reasoning. How do we do this? And you can probably guess, we simply iterate this in a hierarchy, where we start out with a Pi0, we train a Pi1, that's optimal, assuming actions are interpreted according to Pi0. And then we use this Pi1 as the conventions, as the meaning for the actions for the next level. Or in general, we always assume past actions are played by some static Pi I minus 1, and the future is then in self-play with Pi I. And always at every level, the near-optimal play slide from one level induces conventions for the next level. So at this point, you're probably thinking, this looks very familiar to me. I've seen hierarchies before. I know cognitive hierarchies. What is he reinventing here? It's bad enough to reinvent the symmetries from the other play paper that were already done on the Mars rover. Now he's also reinventing cognitive hierarchies. And it's very close, but crucially different. And that crucial difference makes it a lot more confusing, but also more useful. So let's start with the first level for OBL and cognitive hierarchies. If I'm playing what is a cognitive hierarchy? It's playing a best response to some other policy and then iterating that process. Okay? So crucially, both of them assume that past actions were played by Pi0. And that means if I'm playing a best response to a random agent, I will still interpret all actions as being fully grounded because the random agent has no counterfactual information. The difference is the future. OBL is going to assume that Pi1 is going to act optimally based on these beliefs. While in cognitive hierarchies, I assume the random agent is going to play in the future with me. And as a consequence, cognitive hierarchies would never learn at Pi1 to use the grounded signaling. I would never pay $5 to remove a barrier if, as a consequence, in the next time step, some random agent is going to not look at what the world is and just take a random action. So cognitive hierarchies cannot learn optimal grounded policies, and therefore doesn't have the same bootstrapping process. Any more questions? Otherwise, I'll go on to the properties of this. So this all sounds pretty bizarre, but it has nice theoretical properties. In particular, if you train this with a softmax policy and a finite temperature, then given a unique policy, given a starting policy Pi0, you have a unique policy Pi1. So there's a single solution to this. It's no longer weird. Take Multiagent Learning, you have a lot of different equilibria. This is all gone. You have a single equilibrium once you start with Pi0. And actually, OBL is a policy improvement operator. So every time you take Pi0 and you run OBL on it, you get something that's better, apart from a term that vanishes as the temperature goes to 0. And if you repeat this process and you converge to a fixed point at some high level of your hierarchy, that's actually an epsilon subgame perfect equilibrium of the deck-bound DP, which is nice. So this is not just something where you can get conventions, but you also can converge to an equilibrium. And if you take as a starting point any policy Pi0 that doesn't condition on private information, you will get an optimal grounded policy at Pi1. So in cognitive hierarchies, it matters exactly what policy you use to play best response to. In OBL, it doesn't really matter. As long as your policy doesn't convey counterfactual information, you will get an optimal grounded policy. So this sounds all complicated, but the nice news is that we can actually train it very, very efficiently by using what I call the fictitious transition mechanism. So here's our Q function again, where we have the state of the world that we would be in had Pi0 played so far. Then we have the expected future return, And what we do is, in independent Q learning, we simply we simply train by bootstrap against the target. What happens? Yes?
Hi,
Please.
sorry to interrupt. I think there's a question from Franz that might be a clarification. So maybe before going forward, I'm just gonna like.
Yes, yes. I would. So you're saying, and perhaps I didn't completely correctly understand the whole mechanism of OPL here, but so what I kind of understood is that, okay, so both players interpret the world according to this, well, say Pi0, this default policy somehow, and then they update their own policies. But if you now do this joint update, how can you guarantee that there's actually going to be a improvement? Normally, we've always done this kind of like alternating maximization. As soon as you do a joint update, then you can somehow miscoordinate again, no?
Yeah. So the thing is, here you can't miscoordinate. So look, we're looking at turn-based games.
Oh, it's kind of like
so it's like Hanabi. It's my turn, your turn, my turn, your turn. And because we're playing Pi0 up to now, then Pi1 ever after, we can do strict policy improvement.
Oh,
right? This is equivalent to having a fixed policy Pi0 played until time step t, and then playing an improved policy Pi1 ever after. They obviously know what Pi1 is ever after, so I can, at every time step t-1, I can know that you're going to play Pi1 in the future, and therefore, at worst, I could play Pi0 now, but I'm going to do policy improvement. I'm going to maximize over my action space, right? So that's why this is a policy improvement operator. Obviously, that view of the world where you have every possible trajectory and then you play it with Pi0 until then, and then Pi1 after is way too expensive. So we have to have a way of training this scalably, and that's what's shown on the slide. Great question, Franz.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
So here, what we're going to do is we're going to not learn from the action. So this is a game state of Hanabi. Think about it. We get some observation, we evaluate it, take an action, new state, my partner plays, and I get my target ST+1 as the ST+2, right? That I'm going to bootstrap against in Q learning. So it's like 2 time steps plus the maximum of the next time step. In OBL, we never actually learn from the true transitions. Instead, we only ever learn from what the transitions would have been had the state of the world been sampled from a distribution conditions on my Pi0. So the agents are playing Pi1 just wonderfully in self-play. It's always Pi1 playing with Pi1 all the way along. However, we never train on those transitions. Instead, we train on fictitious transitions where we ask ourselves, what's the distribution of the world, given that I'm observing tau I, had Pi0 gotten here with me? That gives me a new state of the world. I apply my action to that state of the world. I evaluate my partner's move in the subsequent state. I calculate the target, 2 steps of fictitious transitions. I get the target and I learn from this. And this means I can implement OBL on top of any deep parallel algorithm, as long as I implement this fictitious transition mechanism, which simply uses autoregressive model that we can train in a supervised way, large scale, right? So all that works beautifully. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to show you the results quickly. This is the toy game where OBL learns to upload grounded policies. Obviously, cognitive hierarchies does not. And then we're looking at Hanabi, where OBL, if we look at it, at the first level learns these very grounded policies. So here, red is the probability of playing a card that you know everything about color and rank. The first level basically plays grounded Hanabi, has very little conventions, and as you increase the levels, it starts to play more and more colors just based on the cards, just based on the color, and it ends up with a distribution quite similar to a human clone bot, very different from self-play methods. Self-play methods actually play a lot of cards blind, because if I play my card when you discard your second, I know nothing about the card I'm playing. And excitingly, this leads to really, really good scores when paired with a human. So this is a proxy bot for human gameplay. This is trained on supervised data. And our OBL levels, as you iterate them, get scores from 14 points to 16 points in this really harsh counting scheme, much better than other play, much, much better than the self-play methods. And we're also robust in ad hoc team play when paired with other pre-trained bots that we've used that are so diverse, one color hinting bot, one rank hinting bot. It becomes this very, very robust, very grounded bot that actually sticks to the rules of Hanabi, unlike the other methods. And again, we didn't have to know the symmetries to do any of this. So I think there's a second principle of coordination. Those shall not assign arbitrary meaning to symbols and actions if trying to coordinate. I don't know how we're doing on time. I think we're kind of over. I have the answer to the first question before. What if you don't know the symmetries and you want to do other play? Here are the Hessian eigenvectors on a cost surface. And it turns out we can use these session eigenvectors to do optimization, and we can also do zero-shot coordination with this, because symmetries lead to repeated eigenvalues, and repeated eigenvalues lead to inconsistent symmetry breaking in optimization. I don't have time for the details, but we need to do a lot more future work. We have to uncover all the principles of coordination. We've just uncovered maybe the first two. We have to move towards human-eye coordination a lot more earnestly, so understanding how we can tweak those principles and bring in human biases. We have to understand how we can understand problems and then solve them separately, and humans can adapt on the fly. This is all fantastic. And we have to stop playing games. I love card games, although sometimes I hate Hanabi. And we have to move from cards to cars. So let's build some more benchmarks that are closer and more inspired by actual real-world settings, the high-level interactive structure of driving, move to the real world, and then ultimately build these, understand large-scale multi-agent systems like climate change, like fake news, like pandemics. And that's the end of the talk. We live in a multi-agent world. Think MAL when we're doing ML. You've seen all the other things. And a lot of the code is open source. Get on board. A lot of exciting work to do. Thank you all for listening. Any final questions?
Yay, thanks a lot, Jakob. I don't see any in the Q&A yet, but there might be popping out, so let's give it maybe a minute. Meanwhile, I would also like to point out to everyone that Jakob started his talk at 7 in the morning in his time zone, so let's give him, if nothing else, kudos for that as well, because, yeah, my God. Yes, thanks. If there are any more questions, guys, ping either chat or question. Let me check. Otherwise, yeah.
I'll have one in any case.
Okay, go for it, Franz.
About the OBL as well. It's a very interesting topic, and I'm certain I'm not capturing all the details here, but so it seems a bit as if indeed. So you want to move away from all these kind of like arbitrary coordination actions to some extent. So this arbitrary signaling. And to one extent that makes sense, but on the other hand, pretty much everything that we have been calling coordination in game theory is these kind of like arbitrary conventions, right? Like the chicken game or the battle of the sexes, all these kind of things. It is kind of like, okay, are we going to do this, or are we going to do this, or are we going to trade off? But somehow it's arbitrary. So, if we take this capability away, it seems as that might severely affect the payoff in many domains. And so I understand that you try to overcome this perhaps by somehow then iterating this, but I could well imagine that iteration might not always work, right? There might be kind of like joint symbols that need to be introduced in order to make the next step.
Mm-hmm. So this is a really good question. So first of all, remember the goal here is zero-shot coordination. The goal is to do well with other agents independently trained at test time, right? I completely agree. If you're doing self-play, go as arbitrary and as weird, discarding my third card on even moves means you should play your second card. Discarding my fifth card on odd moves means you should get up and run away from the table. I don't care, it's self-play. You can do whatever you want, right? But my claim is that mostly we don't actually live in a self-play world. Mostly there will be other agents that we have to work with, right? And at least what this means is you have to be able to randomize, you have to be able to be robust, and you have to try to avoid arbitrary symmetry breaking. And that's what OBL does. Where's OBL going to fail? OBL is going to fail at cheap talk. Now, you might argue cheap talk is kind of pointless anywhere in zero-shot coordination, but that isn't true. Because if we live in, remember we live in sequential games where we have repeated time steps. And that means, Franz, I can actually introduce symbols in principle. I should be able to introduce symbols in cheap talk. But you should still think about OBL and about zero-shot coordination, because otherwise I could introduce very cryptic symbols. For example, I could shuffle my dictionary every single time step. Totally legit in self-play, perfect self-play policy, but obviously a really, really bad idea in zero-shot coordination. So yes, there are certain things that OBL cannot do for you. And the main thing that comes to mind is you can't introduce symbols in a cheap talk channel, even though there might be a way of doing that because the game is extended.
All right, but so just and then I'll give other people also a chance to still ask any questions. But putting it, I guess, to Peter Stone's favorite example of playing a pickup soccer with people. Now, if I join people on a soccer field, I might figure out quite easily that somehow the team that I find myself now in has adopted these perhaps arbitrary conventions. I don't know. They often do this type of attack over the left side and not over the right side, or I don't know.
I don't think they're arbitrary. If they were arbitrary, they would not be interpretable, right? I think what we don't realize, the things that humans do are actually hugely regularized. How often do you talk to someone and shuffle the meaning of all your words every hour? You don't. How often do you play soccer and completely change everything you do arbitrarily every minute, right? You don't. They're highly regularized. And that regularization will come out of zero-shot coordination. If you think about zero-shot coordination, you will get to those policies, right? And that's exactly, I mean, that's in some sense the entire framework. You want to have policies that can be adapted to within the episode. What does that mean? Well, it means exactly that you should learn policies that break symmetries only to the extent that it can be followed by other agents, right? So for example, in Hanabi, what I can do is I can actually do things like, yes, I could use the fact that red was played first, and then you can see that the color that was played first is different from the others, right? But that is sort of a grounding within the episode, and that's the goal of zero-shot coordination. That's the goal of Offbelieve Learning, right? Grounding within the episode. And I think what's crucial here is, unlike ad hoc team play, where if you tell me like you want to do ad hoc team play, yeah, well, I have what team, right? And if you give me the team, it's a single agent problem. If you don't give me the team, it's unspecified. Here we're saying, well, you have to actually think about what team is a good strategy to be adapted to, right? It's not just about playing along with the team. The challenge also of coming up with a team that can be adapted to, right? So we're trying to address both sides of the equation rather than saying one of them is given, you play best response.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Great question, thank you.
Cool, we have 2 more questions. I don't know if you're okay for time, Jacob. We could go for it.
Let's do it quickly.
Okay, very good. Stephen, do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for the great talk. So we know that self-play has a lot of pathologies because it's essentially outputting a best response. So I was wondering if you looked at methods that sort of regularize during training, such as no regret algorithms or fictitious play as a baseline.
This is all, everything is fully cooperative. So the notion of no regret doesn't really work. Fictitious play is very close to cognitive hierarchies, which is what I'm comparing it to in the OBL part. Exactly.
Got it. Thanks.
Great question. Thank you.
Okay.
How dependent on pi0 is OBL? Did we just see that question?
Come again? There's another question that popped in there. Hold up, from someone else. But
yeah.
If you can answer that one quick, because you have one more that I already said would be answered.
Okay. So how dependent is it? Yeah. As long as pi0 is not looking at prior information, you will get the same pi1 because it's going to be the optimal grounded policy. And then from there on, you don't care. So all of the pi0s that don't look at prior information will lead to exactly the same pi infinity. Okay. So in that case, it's independent. You could see it with the human imitation policy. But again, the point of my agenda right now is to understand the fundamental building blocks of coordination rather than say, if you give me a problem setting and human data, I can train a supervised bot. Yes, we can. But that's boring. I don't want to do that. I want to understand, if you give me a problem setting and no human data, how do I build a human policy? That's the track I'm on. Sounds crazy, but also a lot of fun. So, that's the thing that I'm trying to do here. Okay, last question.
Amazing. Last question from Manfred. Do you want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for your talk. Quite interesting. So you presented a couple of evaluation when you tried the train agents and you tried your train agent with humans. And I was wondering, how do you avoid in this case one-sided coordination? And what I mean by this is that usually humans are very adaptable, right? They can find ways to adapt to failures on the policy of the area. I've seen a couple of papers dealing with that. I was wondering, how do you actually prevent that in Hanabi?
Yeah, there's no way to once for prevent it, but it's a fair evaluation. We compare the self-play method and the other play method in the same setting. Actually, I take that back a little bit. The underplay paper we used real humans, so those will be very adaptable. But again, it's a fair evaluation, and each human only plays a single game with each of the bots, right? So you would have to adapt within the episode. For the last part of the talk, we used the human clone bot policy, and that policy is relatively dumb. It's trained on human data, but it's not, when we play with it, it's not very adaptable. So it plays kind of like a mediocre human policy that we don't think is very adaptive. Yeah, great question, thank you.
Cool, that is it. Well, join me everyone in like silently clapping via your video call for Jakob. Thanks a lot, Jakob. This was really, really a great talk. I enjoyed it a lot. You've gotten a lot of interactions, so that's hopefully a good sign. Yeah, and
awesome. Thank you for the great questions, everyone.
Yeah,
thanks. It was really nice. I enjoyed it.
I think does anyone have more details about next week's talk? Amazing. Cool. See you all there. Thanks again, Jakob.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.